Hey everybody. So this unit in Learning Module 4 I'm referring to as Elizabethan literary theory. That may sound incredibly heady and esoteric to you. Some of you may be familiar with literary theory as a way to go about reading literature, right? So sort of like a critical lens that we put on in order to read literature. Marxist lens, feminist lens, post-colonial lens, right? Ways of reading literature. What Sidney is doing when he's talking about what I mean by Elizabethan literary theory is more sort of like the function of literature. What is literature supposed to do to its reader, right? Critics now in the 20th and 21st century are getting sort of past the whole reaction of the audience to the literature, and maybe they want to analyze the literature on its own. Maybe they want to analyze the historical context, which is sort of what I do. Maybe they want to analyze the psychological of the characters and of the work itself as opposed to like our reaction to it, right? But literature in the Elizabethan period, as theorized by Sidney, has a very particular function, and that is to teach and delight, is what he calls it in the defense of poetry, which you're reading for this unit, right? Sidney writes the defense of poetry as a reaction to a text referred to as titled "The School of Abuse," right? And that's written by Stephen Gossam, and it is a lambasting of drama, right? Of I guess sort of more so drama than any other literature, but the implications sort of spread to literature as well. And he dedicates it to Sidney, and Sidney responds by writing this defensive poetry as sort of like a little bit of a jab at Gossam, right? Now, Sidney justifies poetry on a number of fronts, right? Poetry has implications regarding universals and particulars, right? And he uses the examples of history and philosophy in order to make his case for poetry, right? History consists of particulars. Philosophy consists of universals. And what poetry does is unite the two. Poetry presents the universals and the particulars, right? Poetry is also able to transcend the world as we know it. Poetry invents another kind of nature, right? A nature that is not sort of bound by the fallen world, right? What he says to about history is that it's sort of bound to the truths of the of the fallen post-lapsarian world, and it's also the bare was what happened, right? We don't know necessarily about causes when we think about history. We just know of the things that happen, right? He's sort of being a bit of a reductionist when he's talking about history, but that's his criticism. Philosophy is basically universals, theories, abstracts for philosophers. It's sort of an esoteric business, is what Sidney says. And the poet is able to convey the universal truths without being esoteric by teaching and delighting the reader, right? And the reader reaps profit and delight from what they're reading, right? Now, as I may have mentioned last time, education in this time, the trivium, rhetoric, logic, and grammar, these things are taught in order to make for effective citizens, effective, oftentimes courtiers, but effective citizens, right? And poetry sort of performs a similar function, right? The emphasis on it is on education. And the delight part is sort of the spoonful of sugar, as it will, that helps the medicine go down, right? So you're supposed to reap profit through being educated by what you're reading and also delight in what you're reading, right? In a way that you can't get from poetry, not poetry, obviously from poetry, a way that you can't get from reading history, and a way that you can't get it from reading from philosophy, right? Now, Sidney also criticizes Plato. Plato has a very, very famous critique of poetry that it is a representation of truth and reality, but not an actual. It's sort of a lie, right? It's sort of misrepresenting reality in a sense, right? What Sidney's response is that yes, it is a representation, but it does not affirm the thing as truth that is representing, right? It does not show you a painting, for example. It doesn't show you a painting of a person and say that is that person, right? It isn't. It makes it very clear what is the fiction and what is the actual reality, right? But a benefit, like I said, is sort of to transcend the reality, right? The poetic imagination is able to sort of go beyond what is on earth, right? And we are able to create realities that we can learn from, right? Whole new realities that transcend nature. And that is what poetic genius is able to do. And we're sort of supposed to question ideas like genius and these sorts of things. And the genius of invention, right? Invention is a very important thing. It's one of the tenets of rhetoric, and it's also um, a very important thing for the poet, right? Where they're supposed to get their ideas from, right? Sometimes it's a muse, sometimes it's personal experience, sometimes it's a feeling, right? But it's invention is a very important thing in the early modern period, especially, right? And also it's a rhetorical thing because we think about inventing arguments, but it's used as a poetic thing as well, right? This was not a published work by Sidney. This wasn't published until many years later. The only thing really of his, and nothing was published in his lifetime. The only thing that was completed was his Astrophil and Stella sonnet sequence. That's the only thing that we think was actually complete, right? The defense of poetry. He's not writing these things for money. He's writing these things sort of for himself and for a small coterie of readers who are looking at what it is he's writing. And, we may think that he's got some very high aspirations for what poetry is supposed to do, right? But at the same time, there is a function of poetry, a function of narrative, as opposed to just being a story, right? Something to entertain us, right? It has a very specific didactic function, which, I think we learn from the things that we read, right? We learn from examples. We see the examples and we see how these things play out. So you're supposed to learn from Astrophil and Stella in a way that, maybe persistence and folly, but, folly like behavior is not the way to achieve your ends, right? You're supposed to notice, and be able to read and see where Astrophil makes his mistakes. And from Sidney's great epic, his longer epic pastoral work, the Arcadia, sort of the same thing, right? We're supposed to learn from the follies of these knights in order to sort of like come to conclusions about proper sort of behavior, right? But, all these things are tied up with court politics. All of these things are tied up with what is the ideal behavior, how should we behave, right? So all these things are sort of related. But I think that one thing that you need to realize is that when it comes to literary theory in the time, literature has this purpose for teaching. It's not necessarily new to the Elizabethan, it's not necessarily novel to the Elizabethan period, but it certainly is something that is emphasized in the Elizabethan period, is the teaching aspect of texts, of literary texts, of fictions, right? The things that we can learn from fictions. And you'll do a little learning about fictions when you read the selections from the Fairy Queen. So I'll talk to you about that in the next version of my short, pithy lectures. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Okay? Thank you.